Take six.
My one big thing, it's a big topic. So my one big thing last week, in last week's episode, was the Saudi-Israeli normalization pause. And as I said, it's a big subject. It's ongoing, seemingly ever-changing. And really, it's not possible for me, I'm not an expert, to get it all in one go. Anyway, so some number of things prompted me to revisit this week. So this is sort of Saudi-Israeli normalization part 2. And I wanted to add a few thoughts, actually 3 thoughts to be specific. And my first thought was actually prompted by a comment from one of our listeners. And it was in response to the title of the One Big Thing segment that you posted, Lucian, on YouTube. And the title was Saudi-Israeli Normalization, ? What's in it for Saudi Arabia, ? And at Khalid Al-Umri, 6566 replied, quote, I'd say everything. Partnering with a developed neighboring country, Israel, is much better than what we currently are doing, which is throwing billions into, quote, the cause, unquote. And then close quote what he said. And the cause, by meaning he means the Palestinian cause. And I think if you're looking at this Saudi-Israeli normalization and how things end up, it's an important point. Because this normalization discussion is a 3-way conversation. It's between Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Israel. The Palestinian Authority is not at the table, probably won't get to the table, but they will probably be politely, apprised of the results. If results ever do come forward. And I think it's, obviously that's very frustrating for the Palestinians and others, but it's sort of the situation we find themselves in. I think the commenter reflects the reality from many in the Gulf and in Saudi Arabia. I mean, they recognize the injustice and the inequity of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. They empathize deeply with humanitarian costs this has imposed for decades. So, their grandparents, their parents, today, they've all sort of been very sympathetic and responsive to this cause, and the humanitarian cost on the Palestinian people. But they also believe, the Palestinian cause, as the commenter mentioned, has been mismanaged, and that the current leadership is inflexible, old, and out of touch. And an interesting article today by Douglas Bloomfield in this Jerusalem Post, and he was talking about normalization. It's a good article. But he talked about the Palestinian Authority and its situation. And this is what he says, quote, the Palestinian Authority is weak, corrupt, and ineffective. Its leader, Mahmoud Abbas, is 87 years old, in poor health, and in the 18th year of a 4-year term, and refusing to pick a successor. His maximalist demands on Israel have led many to believe that he is more interested in victimhood than statehood, unquote. And of course, the Palestinian Authority is at odds with Hamas, which controls Gaza. So for many Gulf Arabs, the Palestinian cause is close to their hearts, but both the psychological and financial sort of line of credit limit, as it were, is close to being reached. So I think they look at the issue differently. So I think throughout this process, the Palestine will probably be the Palestinian Authority, and that will probably be observers. And that's sort of what the situation has ended up being. My second thought, and we laughed about this, Lucian, is about the constant speculation, unquote, strategy that Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Ghashyan mentioned that the Israelis are employing. And, this was a tactic that they use. And it was kind of timely because this Wednesday of this week, that One Big Thing episode segment came out that you posted on YouTube channel. And that very morning, the Wall Street Journal, no less, obviously, which is an important source of record, headline an article entitled, quote, Saudis agree with U.S. on path to normalize kingdom's ties with Israel, unquote. I mean, that's a strong statement. And it stated that, quote, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have agreed on the broad contours of a deal for Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel in exchange for concessions to the Palestinians, U.S. security guarantees, and civilian nuclear help, according to U.S. officials. U.S. officials express cautious optimism that in the next 9 to 12 months, they can hammer out the finer details of what would be the most momentous Middle East peace deal in a generation, unquote. So this is not the first time that I wondered if I do, in fact, know nothing. So that was in the morning, Wall Street Journal article. By the evening, both the White House and the U.S. National Security Council had publicly stated that this was not accurate. John Kirby of the NSC said, quote, "Quite frankly, just to be blunt here, I think the reporting has left some people with the impression that the discussions are farther along and closer to some sense of certainty than they actually are. The bottom line is there's no agreed to set of negotiations. There's no agreed to framework to codify normalization or any of the other security considerations that we and our friends have in the region," unquote. So for us, I think you might agree here too, Lucian, the only real takeaway here is that both of these things are probably true. A framework is being discussed, and it is far, far away from a potential agreement at this point. So that's thought number two. The constant speculation continues. Final thought, number three. And in the last segment, we talked about negotiating tactics and how it makes sense for Saudi Arabia to engage with the U.S. to see what is possible. Laura Rosen, who writes for The Diplomatic and is somebody that I find to be well-sourced, credible, and responsible, wrote recently, and this is a long quote, so bear with me. Some White House officials believe that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has made a strategic decision to go for Israel normalization while Biden is in office, mainly because he understands that he only gets what he wants with a Democratic president. A Saudi export source, speaking not for attribution, said in an interview, this was August 4th, the interview, quote, "U.S. officials say now that he's bought into it, the goal is to try and get a deal done by the first quarter of 2024. This is still Laura Rosen writing. While Biden himself was apparently not yet sold on the prospective deal, U.S. and Saudi sources said there had been progress in talks last week between Jake Sullivan and the MBS team. A Saudi expert source, again, still Laura Rosen, said Sullivan returned from the meeting, that meeting in Jeddah, July 27th, with the framework was what would be the U.S. elements of such a normalization deal. These four elements are a security guarantee for Saudi Arabia, and this is in parentheses, not a NATO-type Article 5 treaty pact, but something described as a, quote, major non-NATO ally plus, unquote, agreement. The second element is nuclear tech. Third is reliability on U.S. weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. The fourth element involves China, with the U.S. seeking firewalls between the U.S. and China military technology employed by Saudi Arabia. All right, so that's the end of what Laura Rosen had written this week. Ali Shahabi, who we know, smart, plugged-in Saudi analyst, recently commented that, quote, U.S. Saudi ties have warmed unquestionably in recent months, unquote, and that the U.S. Saudi dialogue has, quote, gotten much more extensive and friendly, and this subject, the subject of normalization, is driving that, unquote, driving that increased warmth and dialogue. And my response to this is, from a negotiation point of view, is exactly. From the Saudi perspective, normalization with Israel may or may not make sense at this time. What has been put on the table by the U.S., by the United States, is now on the table. These topics, all of them have been discussed, debated, considered, accepted, declined, whatever. They're now part of the dialogue. In addition, all the players at the table have gotten to know each other better. They come to better understand priorities, come to better understand limits. And so essentially, these good faith negotiations anywhere are usually a win for all involved. Certainly this is good for Saudi Arabia, regardless of the outcome. So that's the one big thing. Those are the three additional points I thought were worth making. One, where and why Palestine is in the situation it is in. Two, the very, the immediate case study of the constant speculation. A Wall Street Journal headline in the morning and a rebuttal from the White House in the evening, and then the value of negotiations just as a process. Just in sort of putting things on the table that weren't there before. So this is a fascinating thing. It merits certainly more than 2 episodes, but it also probably merits people smarter than me. But it's really an interesting time for Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, so many thoughts on that. First is regarding before I kind of get into it, it's worth noting that the headlines on these YouTube videos and in the chyrons you see if you're watching on YouTube and in the write-ups on all the podcasts, like wherever we publish it, there's a bunch of written information, and usually the point is to include a link to the timestamp so people can jump around if easier, if you want to get to the interview or whatever. Those don't like perfectly reflect the actual segment per se.
100%.
And in some ways they're meant, you know this, Richard, but in some ways they're meant to, well, so first of all, there are constraints on how long you can make those.
Sure.
And then there's, sometimes you try to put things in a different light so that it can maybe attract more viewers or attract a more of a casual listener, or I guess viewer on YouTube. But so just as a heads up, just to put that out there, the question that I put in that headline, and I was like, you know what, this is covered in this segment, but there's a lot more to it. And actually, because we didn't perfectly describe what was in that segment, I feel like we got a lot more comments of people being like, well, Richard was really spot on here with this. So well, just to know that as well. Yeah.
But I mean, read the headline: Saudi-Israeli normalization ? What's in it for Saudi Arabia ? I mean, that's spot on. That's exactly what everything is talking about. I mean, that's not misleading at all. It's just that the topic, triggers so much.
Yes. Yep. And that was the point of your one big thing last week. And I think, so as you were speaking, it made me think of the trade offer meme. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's just like some dude going like this, and it just says trade offer, and then people put whatever they want in there. This is the trade offer of all trade offers, involving many parties with many different things. And Richard, as you know in sports, you have straight up trades for two players. You have two players for each other. You have players for future draft picks, for considerations,
three-way
for
trades.
cash. You have three-way trades. Those are the hardest to pull off, multi-team trades.
Yeah.
This is a multi-team trade with players and future considerations and draft picks all in one. Really, really would be amazing if this came together. Just to add to what you said as well, that the Wall Street Journal headline wasn't incorrect, but they have now what they have what they want to put on the table, which is what you sort of discussed here. But getting there is not easy. There is so much meat left on the bone just in the Palestinian issue in the talks. And then you had Bibi sort of blow that up this week by speaking to Bloomberg, saying it comes up a lot less than you think. It's sort of a checkbox. You have to check it to say that you're doing it. I don't know if that's helpful. He's sort of in this way giving away a little bit, of the value of the deal. He's snacking before a big meal, and so it makes it a little bit less pressure on him at home. You mentioned this. You have the U.S. Congress. They're going to try to sidestep that with an executive security deal between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. But you have the Israeli population and the Israeli government that has to agree to some sort of big deal with the Palestinian people. Don't know if Netanyahu is the guy that's going to make that happen. There just is so much going on here. And I think that but just the thesis that there's progress. People are talking. This is good. People are saying what they want out of this deal. That's also positive. But are we going to get the deal in 2024? Should you take away from that headline that this is going to happen? I don't think so.
No, 100%. And that's why I said at the end, closing off the second thing is, and in fact, both these things are true. They are discussing a framework. It's just it's not imminent, and that's the thing when you see it as a process negotiating play. You see Bibi talking like this, and that's classic negotiating. We don't really want it that much. We're. It's not a big deal to us, which is ridiculous. I mean, this would be the holy grail. I mean, that's the wrong term. this would be such a win for Israel, and of course they think they can achieve it without giving up much at all. As a matter of fact, they think they can achieve it without giving out any more than they gave up for the UAE and the Bahrain Abraham Accords, and in fact they may get it. But boy, they want it desperately. It would mean the world to them, and so that's part of it. Play down like you don't care. I mean, it's never ending. But I still believe, at the nexus of all this is the United States. Think about it. And this is the thing that I first made clear to me when we were talking with Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Qashaiyan, because he's pretty lucid on this, very lucid on this. Saudi and Israel are negotiating U.S. assets. U.S. money, U.S. prestige, U.S. concessions, U.S. military, all these things. So, I mean, we're the bank, we're the guarantor, we're the We're everything on this. And in return, neither one of them, I don't think, is going to give up very much. I mean, Saudi Arabia is certainly not going to, may curtail some uh, security and defense interaction with China and Russia. We're not going to give up real relations or economic relations, certainly with the East or China. I mean, the U.S. has to be smart. It could be giving up a lot for not much, and but by the same token, it sort of reinforces the U.S. place in the world. Only the U.S. could do this. Only the U.S. has assets to do this, and so as this progresses, I'd like for everybody to come out with something that's valuable and tangible and sustainable, and mostly the U.S. because I'm an American citizen.
We saw a lot of, after the Saudi Iranian deal, that the days of the U.S. being a power broker in the Middle East are over. It's China's Middle East now. You don't see China anywhere near this, other than in U.S. demands for Saudi Arabia to maybe not allow them to have military bases in the kingdom, get a little bit away from Huawei tech, etc. You don't have China coming in there saying, hey, like, if you broker this deal, we'll give you a security pact with China. China would never do that. So Richard, this whole region is changing so quickly. And yet this issue seems like there's a lot of progress being made in the discussions and in the framework and setting things up, but nothing has really changed except for the very, very slow hush hush issue by issue improvement in Saudi-Israeli relations that no one wants to talk about. True. Just a really interesting time.
And it is, but also the socialization of the topic is important. This is what I mean by things on the table, is socialization in the relationship with Saudi Arabia and the U.S., socialization of nuclear tech cooperation, of better access to top line security and military apparatuses and material, a security pack of some sort. These are on the table, and you socialize, you talk about them, you give here, you take there, you give there, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a completely different spot about what you think is okay to do. And that's the beauty of it from Saudi's perspective.
Yeah. Why wouldn't they put these out there, make their asks clear, demonstrate interest in talking about these things? We've included a lot in this in our newsletter this week and last week as well about U.S.-Saudi relations improving. And part of that is because they're talking about mutual interest, areas of mutual interest.
And that's exactly what Ali Shahabi said, because this ongoing discussion puts key people in the same room, talking about how they can work together to achieve a goal that they both sides deem worthy. That wasn't happening 12 months ago.
Mm-hmm. And also, Jake Sullivan was just in Jeddah for the Ukraine peace summit talks that Saudi Arabia hosted. So there was some collab there, which is a big deal. Yeah.
And that actually, you're foreshadowing two yellows. One, we want to talk about that thing, but also we're also going to talk about security in the Gulf. Another thing only the U.S. can do.